The only mistake I ever made was thinking he wouldn't remember me. The elevator ride to the top floor felt longer than it should have, each second stretching thin as the numbers climbed, my reflection staring back at me in the polished steel walls, older now, sharper, but not different enough to hide from him. Not from Adrian Volkov, not from the man whose name I had once spoken under oath while the entire courtroom held its breath. The man who had looked at me that day not with anger, but with something far worse, something that had followed me for 7 years. Like a shadow I could never outrun, and now I was walking straight back into it, willingly, deliberately, like I had a choice, like I had ever had a choice since the moment I decided to save him in the only way I knew how, even if it meant becoming the only person who ever stood against him. The doors slid open with a soft chime, and the world changed instantly, quieter, heavier, like stepping into a place where every breath had a price. Men in dark suits glanced at me once, and then away. But I could feel it, the recognition not of my face, but of what I represented, a ghost from a past that wasn't supposed to return. My heels echoed against the marble floor as I walked forward, steady, controlled, even though my pulse was anything but every step pulling me closer to the office at the end of the hall. The one door no one approached without permission, the one door I was about to walk through uninvited. My hand hovered for just a second before I pushed it open, and there he was, exactly where I knew he would be, seated behind a desk that looked like it had never known chaos, like everything in his world existed in perfect order because he demanded it. Adrian didn't look surprised, not even slightly. His eyes lifted from the papers in front of him and landed on me like he had been expecting this moment, like he had been waiting. "I was wondering when you'd come back," he said, his voice calm, controlled, the same voice that used to make entire rooms fall silent, the same voice that had once said my name like it meant something. The door closed behind me with a quiet click that sounded louder than it should have, final, sealing me inside a space that belonged entirely to him. I didn't move at first, didn't speak, because everything between us was still there, every word, every choice, every second from that day, in court frozen in the air between us. "You shouldn't be here," he added, softer this time, not a warning, not yet, more like a statement of fact, but I stepped forward anyway, closing the distance inch by inch until I could feel the weight of his attention, until I could see the shift in his eyes, subtle but real, the crack in the control he wore so well. "I didn't come back for you," I said, even though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. My fingers tightened around the small drive in my hand before I placed it on his desk. The sound barely audible, but impossible to ignore. "I came back because the man you trust is about to destroy everything you built." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was alive, sharp, cutting. Adrian's gaze dropped to the drive, and then lifted back to me, slower this time, more dangerous, like he was recalculating everything he thought he knew. "You expect me to believe you?" he asked, rising to his feet in one smooth motion that made the air feel thinner, heavier. He didn't rush, didn't need to. Every step he took was measured, deliberate, until he stood just a few feet away, close enough that I could feel the heat of him, the presence that had always been impossible to ignore. His hand moved, not fast, not forceful, but certain as it closed around my wrist, grounding me in a way that made my breath hitch despite myself. "You don't walk back into my life after 7 years and bring me warnings," he said quietly, his grip firm but not painful, his eyes searching mine like he was trying to find the truth buried underneath everything I'd said and everything I hadn't. "So tell me, Claire," he added, my name leaving his lips like it had never faded, like it had never been replaced. "Why now?" And for a second, just a second, I saw it again, not the power, not the control, but the question he had never stopped asking, the one I had never answered until now. His fingers did not tighten, but they did not let go either, like he was testing whether I was real or just another memory that refused to stay buried. And I forced myself not to pull away because I knew exactly what would happen if I did. He would read it as weakness, as guilt, as confirmation that everything he believed about me was true. So I held his gaze instead, steady even as my pulse raced against his thumb. "Because you are running out of time," I said, my voice quieter than I expected but clear, each word deliberate, measured, the way I had practiced it 100 times before walking into this building. His expression did not change immediately, but I saw it, the flicker beneath the surface, the part of him that calculated risk faster than anyone I had ever known, the part that had built everything around us. "You always had a sense for drama," he replied, but there was no amusement in it. Only observation. Only distance. Like he was trying to place me back into a version of his past. "That made sense, and you always underestimated me." I answered before I could stop myself. And that was the moment something shifted, subtle but real. His eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, like he had just found a piece of me he remembered too well. His grip loosened, not enough to release me, just enough to change the balance between us. "Then explain it," he said, and this time it was not a challenge. It was a demand wrapped in quiet control. I glanced at the drive on his desk, then back at him. "Everything you need is on there," I said. "Financial transfers, internal communications, timestamps, patterns you would not notice unless you were looking for them." He did not look down, did not even acknowledge the object. His attention stayed on me, unwavering. "You walked into my office after 7 years to hand me a piece of plastic and expect me to trust you." His voice dropped lower, softer, but heavier. "After standing in a courtroom and telling the world I was guilty." The words hung between us, not loud, not sharp, but impossible to ignore, and for a second I felt it again. That day, the lights, the silence, the weight of every eye in the room as I spoke, and the way he had looked at me. Not with anger, not even with disbelief, but with something that had stayed with me longer than anything else, something that had made walking away feel like leaving a part of myself behind. I told them what I had to, I said, and even now it sounded incomplete, insufficient. His jaw tightened just enough for me to notice. "That is not an answer," he said. And he was right, it was not. But it was all I had ever been able to give without unraveling everything. I took a breath, steadying myself. "The man you trust," I continued, forcing the conversation forward before I lost it completely. "He has been positioning himself for months, moving pieces slowly, quietly, making sure no one notices until it is too late." Adrian finally shifted his gaze just for a second down to the drive, and that was all it took. That single glance told me everything I needed to know. He was listening now, really listening. "Who?" he asked, and the word was simple, but the weight behind it was not. I hesitated, not because I did not know the answer, but because saying it out loud would change everything, would break whatever fragile lines still existed between his past and his present, between who he thought he could trust and the truth I had carried for 7 years. "You already know," I said quietly, and his eyes snapped back to mine, sharper now, colder, but not dismissive. "Not anymore." "If I knew, you would not be here," he replied. But there was something underneath it, something that sounded dangerously close to doubt. I leaned in just slightly, enough to make sure he could not look away. "Then ask yourself why I am," I said, and for the first time since I walked in, the silence that followed felt different, not empty, not controlled, but uncertain, like the ground beneath him had shifted just enough to make even someone like Adrian Volkov pause. And I knew in that moment that whatever happened next, whatever choices he made, the version of him that believed I had simply betrayed him was already starting to crack. Adrian did not move for a long second, and that alone told me more than any reaction could have, because a man like him did not hesitate unless something had already begun to unravel in his mind. His hand slowly released my wrist, not abruptly, not carelessly, but with the same controlled precision he applied to everything, and the absence of his touch felt colder than it should have, like stepping out of space I had not realized was holding me in place. He turned slightly, just enough to reach the drive without breaking eye contact, and when he finally picked it up, the room seemed to tighten around that small motion. "If this is a lie," he said, his voice calm but edged with something sharper now, "you walked into the wrong place to tell it." I almost smiled, not because it was amusing, but because it was familiar, the way he framed everything as control, as consequence, as if the world only moved according to the rules he allowed. "If it were a lie," I answered quietly, "I would have stayed away." That landed. I saw it in the slight shift of his shoulders, the fraction of a second where he stopped seeing me as a threat and started seeing me as a variable he had not accounted for. He crossed the room to a sleek monitor embedded in the wall, inserted the drive, and the screen came alive with lines of data, numbers, timestamps, patterns layered over months of activity. And I watch him watch it. The way his eyes moved, fast, precise, absorbing everything at once, his silence stretched, but it was not empty anymore. It was working, calculating, adjusting. These accounts, he said after a moment, not looking at me, they are. Internal, yes, I replied, and they have been rerouting small amounts, nothing noticeable, nothing that would trigger alarms, until you look at the pattern over time. His jaw tightened, just enough to confirm he was seeing it now. The slow bleed, the careful positioning, the kind of move that only someone close would have the access to execute. And the communication logs. I continued, stepping closer, not too close, just enough to stand beside him without crossing the invisible line he always kept. They're coded, but the timestamps match the transfers and the locations. They line up with your meetings. He turned his head slightly then, his gaze cutting to me, sharper now, more focused. You have been watching me. It was not an accusation. It was a conclusion, and I did not deny it. I've been making sure you stayed alive, I said, and the truth of it settled between us heavier than anything else I'd said so far. His eyes held mine for a second longer, searching, testing, like he was trying to find a fracture in my story, the point where it would break, but there was none. Not anymore. I had lived with this too long to let it crack now. 7 years, he said finally, turning back to the screen. You disappeared for 7 years, and now you come back. With this, there was something in his voice then, not anger, not quite, something closer to disbelief, like the timeline itself did not make sense to him. I did not disappear, I said softly. I stayed exactly where I needed to be. His hand stilled on the edge of the console, just for a second, and that was enough because it meant he understood what I was not saying, that everything I had done, every step, every silence, had been part of something larger than that moment in the courtroom. Then say his name, Adrian said, and this time there was no distance in it, no calculation, just a direct line drawn between us, a demand that could not be avoided. I felt it then, the weight of it, the point where everything would shift from suspicion to truth, from possibility to consequence. And I knew that once I said it, there would be no going back to whatever version of the past he had been holding on to. I took a breath, steady but heavy, and met his eyes fully. Michael Reeves, I said, the name settling into the room like something that had been waiting to be spoken for far too long. And the effect was immediate, not loud, not explosive, but precise. Adrian went completely still, the kind of stillness that only came when something hit exactly where it was not supposed to. His gaze dropped for a fraction of a second, then lifted again, colder now, sharper, but underneath it, unmistakable, was recognition. And something else, something that looked dangerously close to betrayal. That is not possible, he said quietly. But the certainty was gone, replaced by something far more fragile. I shook my head once, slow, deliberate. It is already happening, I answered. You just did not want to see it. And in that moment, the man who controlled everything finally looked like he was standing on ground that might not hold. The name did not echo. It settled, heavy and precise, like something that had always been there waiting for the moment. It could no longer be ignored. Adrian's eyes did not leave mine this time. Not even for a second, but I could see it, the calculation breaking apart, piece by piece, because Michael Reeves was not just a name. He was history, loyalty, years built side by side, the kind of trust that did not get questioned, not without consequences. You are wrong, Adrian said finally, but it came slower than before, less certain, like he was saying it because he needed it to be true, not because he believed it. I shook my head once steady. I wish I was, I replied, and that was the moment something shifted completely, not in the room, but in him. His posture straightened, his expression sharpened, and the hesitation that had been there seconds ago hardened into something else. Not denial, not acceptance, but decision. He turned back to the screen, his hand moving quickly now, pulling up additional data, cross-checking, verifying every motion precise, efficient, but faster than before, like time had suddenly become a factor he could not control. If this is real, he said, his voice lower now, focused, then he's been inside every layer of my operation. He has, I answered, stepping closer again, drawn in despite myself. And he has been careful, nothing obvious, nothing that would make you question him, just enough to build leverage. Adrian's jaw tightened, but he did not stop, did not slow, his eyes scanning line after line. And I knew that look. I had seen it before, the moment when he stopped reacting and started adapting. The moment when the man everyone feared became the man no one could outthink. Why now? He asked again, but this time it was different, not suspicion, not accusation, but timing, strategy, and I exhaled slowly, because this was the part one could not avoid anymore. Because tonight is the final move, I said, and that made him pause just for a second, enough to tell me he understood the weight of it. What kind of move? He asked, and I met his gaze fully, the kind that leaves you with nothing. The silence that followed was sharp, immediate, and then it was gone, replaced by motion. Adrian reached for his phone, already issuing instructions, his voice calm, controlled, but faster now, more direct, the tone of someone who did not panic but adjusted, who did not react but restructured the entire board in seconds. I watched him, the way he shifted into that version of himself so effortlessly, and for a moment I almost forgot why I had come, almost let myself believe that. This was enough, that warning him was enough, but it was not, it had never been. He ended the call and turned back to me, closer now than before, his presence filling the space between us in a way that made it impossible to ignore. If you were lying, he said quietly, you put yourself in the worst possible position. I held his gaze steady, even as everything inside me tightened. And if I am not, I replied, then I just saved your life again. The words landed differently this time, not sharp, not defensive, just truth. And I saw it, the flicker in his eyes, the recognition he had been fighting since I walked in, that this was not about revenge, not about unfinished business, but something else entirely, something he had not expected from me. Not after everything. His hand lifted slightly, like he was about to reach for me again, then stopped, the distance between us holding, fragile but real. You said again. He said, softer now, almost himself, and I felt my breath catch, because this was the line I had avoided for 7 years. The one truth that connected everything, the courtroom, the silence, the choice I had made that day. You think I destroyed you, I said quietly, but I was the only reason you walked out of that courtroom at all. Adrian's eyes locked onto mine, sharp, searching, and for the first time since I stepped into his office. The control he wore so effortlessly slipped just enough to reveal something underneath it. Not anger, not power, but the question he had never stopped asking, and the answer he was finally ready to hear. For a second, neither of us moved, and the weight of everything I had just said settled into the space between us like something irreversible. Adrian's eyes stayed locked on mine, but I could see it now. Not just the question, but the fracture underneath it, the part of him that had been holding on to a version of the past that no longer fit. Explain that, he said quietly, not sharp, not demanding, but something deeper, something that sounded like he was bracing for the answer. And I felt it then, the pull of that moment dragging me back to a place I had spent 7 years trying not to relive. The courtroom lights too bright, the air too still, every word echoing louder than it should have. They were not trying to convict you, I said slowly, choosing each word with care because this was the truth that had cost me everything. They were building something bigger, something permanent. Adrian's expression did not change, but his focus sharpened, every piece of his attention narrowing onto me. You had one chance to walk out, I continued, and it was not going to happen if I told the full truth. His jaw tightened slightly, just enough to show me he understood what I was implying, but did not want to accept it yet. So you lied, he said, and the word landed heavier than anything else. Not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. I shook my head, steady. I redirected. I answered. I gave them enough to close the case without digging deeper, without exposing everything else they were looking for. Adrian's gaze flickered, just for a fraction of a second. The realization started to form. Everything else, he repeated, quieter now, and I nodded. Once, they were watching Michael even then, I said, but they did not have enough, not yet. They needed time, and if they had pushed harder that day, they would have uncovered connections that would have pulled you into something you could not walk away from, the silent stretch. But it was different now, not tense, not uncertain, but heavy with understanding that was still settling into place. Adrian turned slightly, pacing once slow, controlled, like he was aligning everything I had, said with everything he knew, and for the first time since I walked in, he did not look untouchable. He looked human, calculating, yes, but also reconsidering. You expect me to believe you protected me by standing against me, he said finally, And there was something in his voice now, not disbelief, not anger, but conflict. I held his gaze, refusing to step back from it. I expected you to survive, I replied, and that was the truth stripped down to its simplest form. His eyes searched mine again, deeper this time, like he was trying to find the moment where this became real, where I stopped being the person who betrayed him and became something else entirely. And you never thought to tell me, he said, softer now, almost like the question was directed inward. And I felt the weight of that more than anything else, because that was the part that had never had a good answer. You would not have believed me, I said quietly. And if you had, you would have tried to fix it your way. His lips pressed into a thin line, not denying it, not confirming it, just acknowledging the truth in it, because we both knew what his way meant: control, confrontation, direct action, the kind of response that would have triggered exactly what I've been trying to avoid. So you disappeared, he said, and this time there was no accusation in it, just a statement, and I nodded once. I stayed close enough to watch. I said, close enough to step in if I needed to. Adrian let out a slow breath, the kind that carried more weight than any words. And when he looked back at me, something had changed completely, not just in how he saw the situation, but in how he saw me. You made a decision for me, he said, and there was no anger in it, only recognition. And I met his gaze without flinching. I made the only decision that kept you here, I answered, and the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full, layered with everything we had not said for 7 years, until finally he spoke again, quieter than before, but more certain. And now you are back because that decision is about to run out. And I nodded, because that was the part that mattered now, not the past, not the courtroom, not the years in between, but what was coming next. Yes, I said, steady, and this time I cannot protect you from alone. The words lingered between us longer than anything else that had been said, and for the first time since I stepped into his office, Adrian did not respond immediately. He just stood there, looking at me like he was recalculating everything he thought he knew, not just about the situation, but about me, and that silence felt heavier than any reaction, because it meant he was considering it, really considering it. You are asking me to trust you, he said finally, his voice low, controlled, but stripped of the edge it had before, and I shook my head slightly, because that was not it, not entirely. I am asking you to see what is already happening, I answered, holding his gaze steady. Trust is your choice. That landed differently. I could tell by the way his posture shifted, not relaxed, never relaxed, but less rigid, less defensive, like he was no longer bracing for impact, but preparing for something else, something bigger. He turned back toward the screen, the data still glowing in cold light, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the quiet filled only by the faint hum of the room. If Michael is moving tonight, Adrian said, more to himself than to me, then he's already set the stage. I nodded once. He has, I said, and he's counting on you not seeing it until it is done. Adrian's hand rested against the edge of the console, fingers tapping once, twice, a subtle rhythm that betrayed the speed of his thoughts. What is the end game? He asked, and this time there was no resistance in it, no denial, just strategy. And that was the shift I'd been waiting for, the moment he stopped questioning me and started working with the information. Control, I said simply, not just your operation, but everything connected to it, the networks, the leverage, the relationships you built. Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly, not in disbelief, but in focus. He cannot take that without exposure, he said, and I stepped closer, just enough to stand beside him again. He is not planning to take it openly, I replied. He is planning to make it look like you lost it. That made him still just for a second. The implications settling in, not destruction, not confrontation, but erosion, the kind that left nothing clear to fight against. And you know how, he said, turning his head toward me again, and this time there was something else in his gaze, not suspicion, not distance, but expectation, like he already believed I would have the answer. I held that look steady because this was the part where everything converged, the past, the years in between, and the reason I was standing here now. He is using your own structure against you, I said. Key people, small shifts, subtle changes that add up over time until the system adjusts without you realizing it. Adrian exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that marked a decision forming, not fully made yet, but close. Then we stop him, he said, and there it was, the certainty returning, not blind, not untouched, but sharper now, informed, and I felt something in my chest tighten at the word we, because that was new, not just the plan, not just the strategy, but the acknowledgement, small but undeniable, that I was no longer outside of it. No longer the person who had stood against him, but someone standing here inside his world again. It is not that simple. I said quietly, because it never was with him, never would be. He knows how. You think, how you respond. He has built this around you. Adrian's expression did not falter, but I saw it, the awareness settling in deeper. Then we do not respond the way he expects, he said. And this time his voice carried something steadier, something closer to resolve. He stepped closer, not invading, not forcing, but enough to close the distance that had existed since I walked in. And for a second it felt like the past and present had collapsed into the same space. You said you cannot. Protect me alone, he added, quieter now, and I met his gaze without hesitation. I cannot. I answered, and the truth of that felt different now. Not like a burden, but like a line being redrawn. Good, he said, and there was something in that single word, something that shifted the entire weight of the moment, because you're not doing it alone anymore. And for the first time since I came back, I realized this was no longer about returning to his world. It was about stepping into it again, not as the woman who testified against him, but as the only person who knew how to stand beside him when everything else started to fall apart. The shift happened quietly but completely, and I felt it before I fully understood it. The space between us no longer divided by past and accusation, but held together by something far more dangerous. Alignment. Adrian turned away from me, just slightly, already moving, already thinking 3 steps ahead, his phone back in his hand, as he issued a series of low, precise instructions, names, locations, timing, all of it delivered with the kind of calm authority that made everything around him adjust instantly. But this time I listened differently, not as an outsider trying to understand his world, but as someone who had just stepped back into it, someone who knew exactly how fragile control could be when the wrong person was pulling the strings underneath it. He ended the call and glanced at me again, not checking, not questioning, but expecting. If he is moving tonight, where does it start? He asked, and I stepped closer to the screen. The data's still open, still shifting under his commands. Not at the top, I said, pointing to a pattern buried beneath layers of transactions here. Adrian followed my hand, his focus immediate, sharp, lower-level distribution, he said, and I nodded. He destabilizes the foundation first, creates small failures, delays, inconsistencies, nothing big enough to raise alarms on their own, but enough to force adjustments. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly as the pattern unfolded in front of him, which forces the system to compensate. He finished, and I met his gaze briefly. Exactly, and once it compensates, he controls. The new structure, the silence that followed, was not uncertainty anymore. It was recognition, the kind that came when a plan revealed itself completely, not as pieces, but as a whole. Adrian moved again, faster now, his hand flying across the console, isolating nodes, redirecting access, shifting internal pathways in real time. If we cut him off here, he said more to himself, we disrupt the chain before it stabilizes. I watched him work, the precision, the control, the way he adapted, without hesitation, and it reminded me exactly why Michael had chosen this approach, because direct confrontation would have never worked, not against someone like Adrian. He will anticipate that, I said quietly, and Adrian did not stop, did not even slow. Then we do not cut him off, he replied. We let it run. That made me pause just for a second, because that was not what I expected. Not the immediate correction, not the instinctive shutdown, but something else, something more calculated. You're going to let him think it is working, I said, and Adrian's lips curved slightly, not a smile, not warmth, but recognition of the strategy forming between us. He built this expecting me to react, he said, his voice steady, grounded, so I will not. I felt something shift again, not just in the plan, but in the way we were moving together now. Not opposing, not colliding, but aligning in a way that felt almost too natural after everything that had happened. Then we need to know his end point, I added, stepping closer again, drawn into the rhythm of it, where he expects everything to lead. Adrian's eyes flickered toward me for a brief second, and there was something there, something new, not guarded, not distant, but aware, like he was seeing me not as someone who had disrupted his past, but as someone who could shape what came next. You already know, he said quietly, and it was not a question. I held his gaze for a second longer, then looked back at the screen, tracing the final pattern hidden beneath everything else, the one piece I had not said out loud yet. He is not just taking control, I said slowly. He is positioning you to lose it publicly. Adrian went still again, not frozen, not caught off guard, but focused in a way that meant he understood exactly what that implied. Not just loss, not just disruption, but reputation, influence, everything tied to perception. So when it happens, I continued. It does not look like he took anything. It looks like you failed. The silence stretched, sharp and precise. And then Adrian exhaled slowly, the decision settling into place completely now. Then we make sure he is the one exposed instead, he said. And there was no hesitation in it anymore. No uncertainty, just direction. He turned to me fully this time, closing the last bit of distance that had remained between us. And for a moment, everything else fell away. The screens, the data, the plan, leaving only the two of us standing there again after 7 years. But not the same, not even close. You came back at the exact moment. Everything changes, he said, his voice quieter now, but stronger in a different way. And I held his gaze steady because this was the truth neither of us could ignore anymore. No, I replied softly. I came back because it already had. And in that moment, I realized this was no longer about stopping what was coming. It was about surviving what it would turn us into when it was over. The air in the room felt different now, sharper, like every second carried weight it did not have before, and Adrian did not step back this time. He stayed where he was, close enough that I could see every shift in his expression, every calculation happening behind his eyes. But there was something else there too, something quieter, something that had nothing to do with strategy. Then we do not just expose him, he said, his voice steady, but lower now, more deliberate. We make sure there is no way back for him. I held his gaze, understanding exactly what he meant without him having to say it. Not retaliation, not chaos, but finality, the kind that closed every door at once. That means timing matters more than anything, I replied, turning slightly back toward the screen because if I stayed in that moment too long, I would forget why I came here in the first place. The data still shifted under Adrian's commands, patterns adjusting, pathways rerouting, but beneath it all the original structure remained, still moving exactly the way Michael intended. He is expecting resistance at some point. I continued, tracing the sequence with my eyes, but not immediately. He will wait for the system to stabilize first, for the changes to look natural. Adrian nodded once, already following, already ahead, so we let it stabilize. He said just enough. I glanced at him briefly, because that was the line, the edge between control and collapse. Too long, and he locks it in. I warned, and Adrian's expression did not shift, but I could feel the precision in his thinking tighten. Then we choose the exact moment it looks complete, he said, and there was again that certainty, not reckless, not blind, but calculated in a way that made everything else align around it. I turned back to the screen, pulling up the final layer of data I had not shown him yet, the one I had kept back until I knew he was ready to see it. There is something else, I said quietly, and Adrian's attention snapped to it immediately. He is not doing this alone. The words landed heavier than anything else, because this was the part that complicated everything, the part that made the plan larger than just one betrayal. Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly, not in disbelief, but in focus. Who else? He asked, and I hesitated for just a fraction of a second, because this was the part that made everything personal in a way neither of us could ignore. People who owe him, people who think they are. Protecting something bigger, I said, choosing the words carefully. He is not just shifting power, he is rewriting loyalty. Adrian exhaled slowly, and I saw it, the understanding settling in deeper. This was not just about stopping one man. This was about untangling something that had already spread further than either of us wanted to admit. Then we do not just expose him, he said again, quieter now. We expose all of it. I nodded once because that was the only way this ended clean, not by cutting one thread, but by revealing the entire pattern, and that means we cannot rush it. I added, we need proof that holds, proof that cannot be denied or redirected. Adrian's gaze shifted to me again, and this time there was no distance left in it, no barrier, just clarity. You already have it, he said, and it was not a question. I held his gaze for a second. then looked back at the screen, because this was the part one had not wanted to admit, even to myself. I have enough to start it, I said quietly, but not enough to finish it. The silence that followed was not heavy, not tense, but focused, like everything had narrowed down to a single point. Adrian stepped closer again, not imposing, not forcing, but present in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Then we get the rest, he said simply, and there was something in that, something steady, something that did not question whether it was possible, only how it would be done. I felt my breath catch slightly, not from fear, not from uncertainty, but from the realization of what that meant, not just for the plan, but for us, because this was no longer about a warning, no longer about a return. This was about staying, about stepping fully into something neither of us could walk away from once it started. You understand what that means, I said quietly, and Adrian's eyes did not leave mine. Not even for a second. Yes, he replied, calm, certain. It means you're not leaving this time. And the way he said was not a command, not control, but something far more dangerous, something that felt like truth, and for the first time since I walked back into his world, I did not try to argue it. For a moment the room felt smaller, not because the space had changed, but because the distance between choice and consequence had narrowed to almost nothing, and I could feel it pressing in from every direction. Adrian did not move away after he said it, did not step back or give me space to retreat into something safer, something familiar. He just watched me, steady, certain, like he already knew the answer before I gave it. And that was the problem, because a part of me did not want to prove him right. Not again. Not after everything it had cost me the last time. You were assuming I came back to stay, I said quietly, even though the words felt weaker than they should have, like they belonged to a version of me that no longer existed. Adrian's expression did not shift, not even slightly, but his eyes held mine in a way that made it impossible to look away. You did not walk into my office to leave things unfinished, he replied, calm, direct, and there was no arrogance in it, no dominance, just certainty, the kind that came from knowing how people worked, how I worked, and that was what unsettled me the most. Not that he was trying to control the outcome, but that he understood it. I exhaled slowly, turning slightly back toward the screen because it was easier to focus on the plan than on him, easier to deal with patterns and strategies than with the truth sitting between us. We need access to his communication layer, I said, shifting the conversation forward before. It pulled me back into something I was not ready to face. Adrian did not argue, did not push. He followed the change instantly, like he knew when to press and when to let the moment move. You said it was coded, he said, stepping beside me again, his presence steady, grounded. It is, I confirmed, pulling up another sequence, one I had not opened yet, but not unbreakable. He uses repetition, subtle variations, but the structure stays consistent. Adrian leaned slightly closer, not invading, not overwhelming, but focused in a way that made everything else fade out. Then we mapped the pattern, he said, and I nodded, already moving, already aligning with him in a way that felt too natural, too seamless for something built on 7 years of distance. We isolate the base sequence first, I explained, pointing to the repeating intervals. Then we track deviations, the moments where he adjusts for response. That is where he reveals intent. Adrian's eyes followed every movement, every shift, absorbing it instantly. And that gives us the final point, he said, and I met his gaze briefly. It gives us the moment he commits. I corrected softly, and the distinction mattered, because that was when everything would lock into place, when there would be no more room for him to adapt, no more room to disappear behind layers of strategy. Adrian nodded once, the understanding immediate, complete. Then, that is when we move, he said, and there was no hesitation left in him now, no doubt, just direction. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, because this was the part that changed everything, not the plan, not the execution, but the cost. If we do this, I said quietly, there is no version of this where things go back to how they were. Adrian's gaze shifted to me again, steady, unwavering. They were already changing, he replied. And there was something in that, something final, something that made it clear he had already accepted that line had been crossed long before I walked through his door. I held his gaze for a second longer, then looked back at the screen because there was no space left for hesitation. Not anymore. Then we do it right, I said, my voice steadier now, more certain, and Adrian did not respond. With words this time, he just moved his hand, adjusting the system, aligning the data, setting the stage for something that would not just stop what was coming, but redefine everything after it. And as I stood there beside him, watching the pieces fall into place, I realized that this was not just about exposing Michael or protecting Adrian. It was about something far more dangerous, something neither of us had planned for, because the moment we chose to stand on the same side again, we had already changed the outcome in ways neither of us could fully control, and there was no going back from that. The system shifted under Adrian's hands with quiet precision, every adjustment subtle enough to go unnoticed from the outside, but deliberate enough to change the entire structure from within, and I watched the pattern evolve in real time, the same way Michael would be watching it from wherever he was, expecting the sequence to follow the path he designed, expecting control to slip gradually into his hands without resistance. Without interruption, he is monitoring response intervals, I said, my voice low, focused as I tracked the timing shifts across the screen. If we move too soon, he will see it. If we wait too long, he locks everything in. Adrian did not look away from the data, his expression steady, but I could feel the intensity in it, the way he was balancing both edges at once. Then we give him exactly what he expects, he said, and I understood immediately, not full compliance, not full resistance, but controlled reaction, just enough to confirm his assumptions without revealing the truth. Delayed correction, I said, already adjusting the sequence to match, small enough to seem routine. Adrian nodded once. And predictable, he added, and that was the key, because predictability was the one thing Michael would trust, the one thing he would not question. I moved quickly, aligning the response pattern to mirror past behaviors. The same decisions Adrian would have made if none of this had been happening. The same rhythm his system had always followed. And for a moment it felt almost unreal, like we were rewriting something that had already been set in motion, bending it just enough to redirect the outcome without breaking the illusion. He will see this as confirmation, I said, watching the system stabilize under the adjusted parameters. He will think you are reacting exactly the way he predicted. Adrian exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried focus, not relief. Good, he said. Then he keeps going, and that was what we needed for him to keep going, for him to commit fully without realizing the ground beneath him was already shifting. I pulled up the communication layer again, isolating the coded sequences, mapping the variations against the response intervals we had just set, and there was clearer now, the pattern tightening, converging towards single point. He is accelerating, I said quietly, and Adrian's gaze sharpened instantly. Because he thinks it is working, he replied, and I nodded, yes, which means we were close. The word close carried weight, because it meant the moment we had been building toward was approaching, the point where everything would either hold or collapse. Adrian stepped slightly closer, not enough to distract, but enough that I could feel his presence beside me. Steady, unwavering, show me the final path, he said, and I traced it out, step by step, the sequence narrowing, the endpoints aligning, until there was no ambiguity left, no alternative outcome. Here, I said, pointing to the convergence. This is where he finalizes control. Adrian studied it for a second, then nodded once, slow, certain. Then this is where we end it, he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice now, no uncertainty, just decision. I felt my breath catch slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what that meant, because this was the point of no return, not just for Michael, not just for the system, but for us. Once we move, everything comes out, I said quietly, all of it. Adrian turned his head slightly, just enough to meet my eyes again, and there was something in his gaze now that had not been there before, not just trust, not just alignment, but something deeper, something that had been buried under years of silence and misunderstanding. That is the point, he replied. And I held his gaze for a second longer, because this was the moment where everything we had rebuilt in the last hour became real, became irreversible. I nodded once, steady, because there was no other choice left. Then we do not miss, I said, and Adrian's expression did not change, but I saw it, the certainty settling in completely, the kind that did not allow for doubt. We will not, he said quietly, and for the first time since I walked into his office, I believed him completely. Not because of who he was, not because of what he controlled, but because of the way we were standing here now, no longer divided by the past, no longer moving separately, but aligned in a way that made the outcome feel inevitable. And as the system continued to shift beneath our hands, I realized that the real change had already happened, not in the data, not in the plan, but in us, because the moment we chose to trust each other again, everything else became a matter of timing. The moment did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, buried inside the flow of data and shifting patterns, but I felt it before I saw it. The subtle change in rhythm, the tightening of the sequence, the point where prediction turned into commitment. "This is it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but Adrian heard it immediately, his attention locking onto the exact point I was tracking. The convergence we had been building toward now fully formed on the screen, every variable aligning, every path narrowing into a single outcome. "He is finalizing," Adrian said, and there was no doubt in it, no hesitation, just recognition, the kind that came when everything clicked into place at once. I nodded, my fingers hovering over the console, not moving yet, because this was the line, the exact second where everything balanced on timing. Too early, and we exposed nothing. Too late, and we lost everything. "Wait," Adrian said quietly, and I froze, not because he commanded it, but because I trusted the precision behind it. His eyes scanned the final sequence, tracking the last adjustments, the last confirmations, and then he exhaled slowly. "Now," he said, and everything moved at once. I executed the sequence we had prepared, redirecting the data flow, exposing the hidden layers, forcing the system to reveal what had been buried beneath it. Not abruptly, not chaotically, but clean, controlled, undeniable, the kind of exposure that did not rely on force, but on truth. The screen shifted instantly, patterns unraveling, connections surfacing, the structure Michael had built turning against itself in real time. Adrian moved beside me, his commands following mine without hesitation, locking pathways, securing access, ensuring there was no way to contain what had just been revealed. "He will see it," I said, even as the system continued to unfold. And Adrian's response came without pause. "He already has." There was no urgency in his voice, no panic. Just certainty, because this was no longer about anticipation, it was about consequence. The chain reaction had already begun, and there was no stopping it now. I watched the data cascade, each layer exposing the next, each connection leading to another, until the full pattern stood clear, undeniable, complete. "It is done," I said, not as a question, not as a hope, but as a realization. Adrian did not answer immediately. He studied the screen for one more second, one final verification, and then he nodded once, slow, deliberate. "It is done," he repeated, and the weight of it settled into the room. Not loud, not explosive, but final, the kind of final that did not need confirmation. The system stabilized under the new structure, no longer shifting, no longer uncertain, just clear, exposed. And I felt it then, not relief, not victory, but something else, something quieter, the absence of tension that had been there for so long. I had almost forgotten what it felt like without it. Adrian stepped back slightly, not away from me, but out of the immediate space of the console, his gaze still on the screen, but his focus no longer consumed by it. "He has nowhere to go from this," he said, and it was not satisfaction, not triumph, just fact. I turned toward him, studying his expression, searching for something I could not quite name, and what I found was not what I expected. Not control, not dominance, but stillness, the kind that came after everything had shifted into place. "No," I said quietly, "he does not," and the silence that followed was different from all the others, not heavy, not uncertain, but complete, like something that had been unresolved for years had finally reached its end. Adrian's eyes moved from the screen to me, steady, clear, and for a moment, everything else faded again. The system, the plan, the outcome, leaving only that look, that connection we had rebuilt piece by piece without even realizing it. "You knew exactly when to come back," he said, his voice quieter now, but carrying more weight than before, and I held his gaze, not looking away, because this was the truth I could not avoid anymore. "I knew when you would need me," I replied, and the words felt different now. Not like a defense, not like an explanation, but like something that had always been true, whether either of us admitted it or not. "Adrian, did not respond immediately, but something shifted in his expression, subtle, almost imperceptible, and then he stepped closer again, closing the space that had once been filled with distance, with misunderstanding, with everything we had not said for 7 years. And for the first time since all of this began, I realized that what we had just ended was not the only thing that mattered, because in the process of stopping everything from falling apart, we had rebuilt something neither of us had planned for, something that could not be undone as easily as the system we had just rewritten. The silence did not last long. It never did in his world. And I felt the shift before the sound came. The faint vibration of his phone against the desk, a signal cutting through the stillness we had just created. Adrian glanced at it once, just once, and something in his expression tightened again. Not like before, not uncertainty, but awareness. It is already spreading, he said, and there was no need to explain what he meant. The exposure we had triggered was moving beyond this room, beyond his control, reaching places neither of us could pull it back from. I stepped closer to the screen again, watching the system stabilize under the new structure, the data no longer shifting, no longer hiding, just present, undeniable. Then it is working, I said, but even as I spoke the words, I knew this was not the end. Not really, because exposure did not erase what had been built. It only changed what came next. Adrian set the phone down slowly, his gaze returning to the screen, but I could see it, the way he was already moving past the outcome, already calculating the aftermath. It changes everything, he said quietly, and I nodded because that was the truth neither of us could avoid. Not now, not anymore, for him, I said, but Adrian's eyes shifted to me again, steady, deliberate. For us, he corrected, and the weight of that settled deeper than anything else had so far, because this was the part one had not allowed myself to think about, not while I was planning, not while I was watching from a distance, not even when I walked back in his office, the part where everything we had just done would not just expose Michael, it would reshape everything around Adrian. His alliances, his structure, his control, and my place in all of it. I exhaled slowly, grounding myself in the present, because there was no space left for hesitation. Not now, then we stay ahead of it, I said, and Adrian's expression did not shift, but I saw the agreement in it. Immediate, complete, we will, he replied, and there was something in his voice now, not just authority, not just certainty, but something steadier, something that carried through everything we had just done, and into whatever came next. He stepped away from the console, finally breaking the proximity that had held us there, but not the connection, not the alignment. And as he moved, the room seemed to expand again, like the pressure had shifted outward instead of inward. They will start choosing sides, he said, his tone calm, analytical. But I could hear the implication beneath it, the quiet acknowledgement that not everyone would stand where they had before. Some already have. I answered, because that had been happening long before tonight, long before either of us chose to act. Adrian's gaze moved across the room briefly, then back to me, and there was something in it now that had not been there before, not guarded, not distant, but clear, like he was seeing the full picture, not just the threat, not just the solution, but everything in between. And he said, not a question, not a challenge, just a point that needed to be acknowledged. I held his gaze steady because this was the moment where everything became defined, not by the past, not by what I had done 7 years ago, but by what I was choosing now. I made my choice when I walked in, I said quietly, and the truth of it felt different now, not like something I had to defend, but something I'd already accepted. Adrian studied me for a second longer, not searching, not testing, just seeing, and then he nodded once, slow, deliberate, like that was enough, like it had always been enough. Then we moved forward, he said, and there was no weight of the past in it, no hesitation, just direction. I felt something in my chest settle at that, something that had been unresolved for years finally aligning with where I stood now. Not between two sides, not caught between what was and what could have been, but here exactly where I had chosen to be, together, I added, and Adrian's gaze held mine for a brief second, something unspoken passing between us, something that did not need definition. And then he nodded again, quieter this time, but no less certain. Together, he repeated, and for the first time since everything began, the word did not feel fragile. It felt inevitable. The room did not feel like a battlefield anymore, but did not feel safe either. It felt like something in between, a place where decisions had already been made and consequences were beginning to unfold. Adrian stood near the window now, looking out over a city that had always moved at his command. But tonight it was different, not out of control, but no longer entirely his. And I understood that feeling more than I wanted to admit, because I had lived in that space for 7 years, watching, waiting, knowing that the moment I stepped back in his world, nothing would ever be the same again. It is quieter than I expected, I said softly, breaking the silence that had settled between us, and Adrian glanced back at me, his expression unreadable but not distant. Not anymore. That is because the noise has not reached us yet, he replied. And there was something in that, something steady, something that acknowledged what was coming without needing to name it. I nodded slightly. Because I understood, because I had always understood that the real impact of a decision did not happen in the moment it was made, but in everything that followed. Adrian stepped away from the window and walked toward me again, not with urgency, not with control, but with intention, each step measured, each movement grounded in something that felt different now, less about power and more about presence. You could have stayed away, he said quietly, and it was not a question, not a challenge. Just a truth placed between us. I held his gaze, steady, because this was the part that mattered more than anything else, more than the plan, more than the outcome. I answered, and the honesty in it felt heavier than anything else I had said tonight. Adrian's eyes searched mine for a second, not looking for weakness, not looking for doubt, but something else, something that had nothing to do with control. And then he nodded once, slow, like he understood more than I had said, like he always had. And now you are here, he said, and I felt something shift in that simple statement, something final, something that closed the distance the past had created. Now I am here, I repeated, and for the first time, it did not feel like a return. It felt like a choice. Adrian stepped closer, stopping just short of where the space between us would disappear completely. And for a moment, everything else faded again. The city, the system, the consequences waiting outside these walls, leaving only this moment, this connection that had survived everything we had put it through. You changed the outcome, he said, his voice quieter now, but stronger in a way that did not need force. And I shook my head slightly because that was not the truth I wanted to leave him with, not this time. I corrected softly, and something in his expression shifted at that. Not dramatically, not visibly, but enough. Enough to tell me that he understood what I was really saying, that this was not about what I had done alone or what he had controlled alone, but about what we had chosen together when it mattered most. The silence that followed was not empty, not heavy, but complete, like something that had been unfinished for years had finally found its place. And as I stood there with him, I realized that the real story was never about betrayal or power or even survival. It was about choice, about the moments when everything could fall apart and the decisions that determined whether it did. And that was what stayed with me long after everything else had settled, because in the end, the only thing that ever truly mattered was who you chose to stand with when it counted, and that is something no one else can decide for you. So choose carefully, choose with clarity, and when the moment comes, do not walk away from what you know is right, even if it costs you everything at first, because sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that save not just someone else, but who you become in the process.